बुझावे नार जलतनी ये कर कुदरत फरमा तू चलागी आश भक्तों ने के बख्शे नूरे ईमान तू।
Reflections on the spiritual significance of the Prague, Oklahoma accident. When Meher Baba first came to America in the early 1930s, he made several references to his work with America and to America's potential for spiritual growth. After leaving America in 1931, he wrote to his lovers, quote, "I will come back to America to pour out my love to you and to spiritualize America," close quote. Before leaving for his trip to the West in 1932, Baba told a reporter for the Associated Press, quote, "The only miracle for the perfect man to perform is to make others perfect too. I want to make the Americans realize the infinite state which I myself enjoy," close quote. When he arrived in New York City in 1932, journalist Frederick Collins asked Baba about America's problems. Baba replied, quote, "America has great energy, but a great deal of it is misdirected, and misdirected energy produces destructive complexes, and these, in turn, produce fear, greed, lust, and anger, which result in moral and spiritual decay," close quote. When returning from that 1932 trip, he told a reporter in Ceylon in January 1933, quote, "My reason for starting in America is that America, being the most deeply engrossed in material things and suffering the most in consequence, is the soil on which a new spiritual rebirth will first take place. America requires only the guiding hand of a master to redirect its material powers to the heights of spirituality," close quote. In my presentation today, I'd like to talk about Meher Baba's 1952 accident in Prague, Oklahoma. I'll reflect on the accident from a theological or spiritual perspective and suggest some ways that we might understand the spiritual significance of this event as an aspect of Meher Baba's universal work, and especially of his work for America. I want to begin by acknowledging the speculative ground on which we stand. For one thing, as Meher Baba says, quote, "It is absolutely impossible for an ordinary man to understand my work. With my universal mind, I work on an unlimited scale for the universe. To understand what I do is not within the bounds of human intellect. My every breath does this work constantly, while outwardly you find me doing nothing special. You cannot grasp the internal mystery," close quote. Well, in addition to acknowledging the mysterious nature of Meher Baba's work, I'd like to acknowledge that everything I have to say about his work is the result of my own reflections and should not be taken as fact, nor as being inflexible in nature. I'm open to comment, criticism, and correction where appropriate. Finally, I would like to assure you that none of what I'm about to say is meant to be political in any way. My sole purpose is to explore the significance of Meher Baba's work, and especially his suffering in America, and how his suffering may be related to his work of unbinding some of America's most tightly bound karmic ties. To put the Prague accident into historical context, the accident occurred shortly after the end of Meher Baba's new life, which concluded with what he called his mononash work. This work was followed by what Meher Baba called his life phases. These were comprised of his complicated free life phase, which began on March 21st, 1952, his full free life phase, which began on July 10th, 1952, and his fiery free life phase, which began on November 15th, 1952. Meher Baba's Mononash phase took place over a 4-month period from October 16th, 1951 to February 1952. Before commencing this work, which was to be the culmination of his new life, Meher Baba wrote to Elizabeth Patterson to confirm to her and his lovers in the West that he planned to travel to America immediately following the completion of this work. In October 1950, he asked her to circulate the following message, quote, "The necessary arrangements having been successfully completed by Elizabeth and Norina, I shall, if God so wills it, and if I am alive, come to the West next year. I have therefore decided to leave India for the West at the end of March, or during the first week of April 1952, and I shall fly directly to America. Later in the year, I shall stay a few weeks each in England, France, and Switzerland. In order that the results of my work from October 16th, 1951 to February 1952 may be fully manifested in the Western world, either with the fullest success or as an utter failure, I must be in seclusion for the first 2 weeks of my stay in America. I therefore want no publicity of any kind, either when I leave India or when I arrive in America. And for these first 2 weeks following my arrival in America, only a very few of my most intimate Eastern and Western disciples will be staying with me. After these first 2 weeks of seclusion, I shall see everyone everywhere, because eventually I shall have to give to the world the results of my 4 months' work." End of quote. Well, it's evident from this message that Meher Baba considered this work, his Mononash work, to be of particular significance, especially for the Western world. He stated that he wanted to be in seclusion so that this Mononash work, quote, "may be fully manifested in the Western world," end quote. The place where he was to remain in seclusion for 2 weeks was the Meher Spiritual Center in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Typically, on his trips to the West, Meher Baba would stay briefly in Europe or England and visit his lovers there before continuing on. This time, however, he did not do this. He went directly from India to the U.S. without even seeing anyone in New York. Rather, he went directly into a 2-week seclusion with his close disciples at the Meher Spiritual Center. After this seclusion, he welcomed visitors from around the world, fulfilling his promise that, quote, "After these first 2 weeks of seclusion, I shall see everyone everywhere, because eventually I shall have to give to the world the results of my 4 months' work," close quote. After his stay at the Meher Spiritual Center, Meher Baba left for a cross-country automobile trip to Ojai, California, where Agnes Barron had prepared a center for him, which she called Meher Mount. It was on this trip that he met with his fateful automobile collision in Prague, Oklahoma. After the accident, he returned with the rest of the party to Myrtle Beach. However, he did not stay at the Meher Spiritual Center. He spent his entire convalescence at Elizabeth Patterson's house in Myrtle Beach, which she called Yupon Dunes. During that trip, he only returned to the Meher Spiritual Center one more time before leaving for New York City on July 14th, 1952. While in New York, when asked about the accident, he smiled and spelled out on his board, quote, "America was after my blood for a long time," end of quote. On another occasion, he remarked, quote, "Those who were with me at the spot at the time of my car accident in America can alone well describe my own sense of humor as to how thoroughly battered, bruised, and literally helpless and hopeless I was when lying with broken bones in a pool of my own blood together with my dearest ones. Yet I maintained my silence and my consciousness throughout the crisis and the long period of convalescence." End quote. Well, many questions naturally arise when we hear of this terrible accident. Why did Meher Baba allow himself to be so terribly injured in this accident? Why Prague, Oklahoma? Why did he only return one more time to the Meher Spiritual Center? What did he mean when he said, "America was after my blood"? Why did he have to endure even more suffering after already enduring the 2-year ordeal of his new life travels? Why did this accident occur during the life phase that Meher Baba called his complicated free life? Well, reflecting on the Prague accident, Bao Kalchuri has said, quote, "It is significant that the complicated free life ended in America as bindings overcame Baba's life there. These bindings were America's, which assaulted and wounded the Avatar, and which Meher Prabhu uprooted by enduring. It was these bindings which made Baba's free life complicated. The world will know its result when America bows at God's feet. To do that, Baba purposely suffered and bore the assault of these bindings because he had a special mission to fulfill for America." Close quote. Elsewhere, Bao said, quote, "The Avatar cuts through all the unnaturalness in the world and gradually makes a path that becomes clear and natural for mankind to follow." Close quote. When speaking of the state of a perfect master, Meher Baba has said, quote, "All that he does not only does not bind him, but contributes towards the emancipation of others who are still in ignorance." Close quote. Assuming that Bao is correct in his assessment that during the accident in Prague, Meher Baba was working with America's bindings, if we further assume that his involvement with this accident contributed, quote, "towards the emancipation of others who are still in ignorance," close quote, what then could these bindings be that Meher Baba's suffering was freeing others from? If we are willing to accept the idea that Baba's suffering in America was somehow related to his work, which Bao has called uprooting the bindings of America, then we must ask the question, what are America's bindings? Meher Baba typically discussed the idea of bindings in relation to karma and sanskaras. For example, he says, quote, "Through their chaotic pursuits of several lifetimes, most persons are likely to go further away from the goal by the heaping up of binding sanskaras." Close quote. And again, he says, quote, "Unintelligent karma of many lives has created the bindings of the individual soul, and it has to be undone by the persistent creation of intelligent and unbinding karma carried on for many lives." Close quote. Well, in this light, we might then ask, what binding karma might America have in its history that Meher Baba was uprooting in Prague, Oklahoma? Now, as I've said, our reflections on Meher Baba's work may be speculative. However, historical facts are not speculative. For over 2 centuries now, historians have painted a picture of the heroic founding of America upon high religious and philosophical principles. The scholarship of recent decades, however, reveals a much more checkered history. The picture that emerges is one of self-interest, greed, and a disregard for the sanctity of human life. Well, let's start at the beginning. It's often assumed that Jamestown, founded in 1607, and Plymouth, founded in 1620, were the first European colonies on American soil. In fact, according to historian William Katz and others, the first colony was settled in 1526 at the mouth of the PD River near Georgetown, South Carolina, only 57 miles from Myrtle Beach. The colony was founded by the Spanish explorer Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon. Although it was a failed settlement, the group included both enslaved Africans and enslaved Native Americans, and it remains the first known European colony on American soil. Eventually, angry at their mistreatment at the hands of their European masters, the African and native slaves revolted and retreated inland to live together peacefully. Ultimately, without the slave labor needed to sustain their venture, all of the Europeans either died of disease or returned home, abandoning the settlement. Well, this little-known chapter of American history reveals a template that would be repeated over and over again, a story of the mistreatment and enslavement of Africans and the mistreatment of the native people. The first European explorers to arrive in America near the end of the 15th century brought with them a host of European diseases that the native peoples of the Americas were neither familiar with nor had any immunity from. One of the most devastating of these diseases was smallpox, but there were others as well, including typhus, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, cholera, malaria, tuberculosis, mumps, and yellow fever. Some estimates say that the native population in the Americas in 1492 was approximately 60 to 70 million people. By the early 1600s, an estimated 90% of that population, 54 to 63 million people, had died due to the diseases brought by the Europeans. Because of this decimation by disease, the population of native peoples had become drastically reduced by the time the first European settlers arrived to colonize the east coast of America. As more and more settlers arrived and permanent settlements were established, native people were continually pushed further westward, away from their ancestral homelands. Treaty after treaty was made between native people and the American government, and treaty after treaty was broken. Often, the treaties were written deliberately so that the native people would misunderstand them, and then the treaty would be used to force the natives to move further and further inland. The native people were also repeatedly encouraged to adopt the ways of the Europeans so as to assimilate into European culture. 5 native tribes were particularly successful at adopting the ways of the Europeans and interacting with them. These 5 tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole Indians, came to be known as the 5 civilized tribes. The members of these 5 tribes had adapted to European customs as they had been asked to do. Many had even converted to Christianity, and they had signed numerous treaties and agreements with the American government. However, when Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, he signed into law what was called the Indian Removal Act, which required all Indian tribes living in or closely adjacent to any American state to be removed to a tract of land designated for their use. At this time, many native peoples accepted the inevitable, packed up, and moved west to this designated land, known simply as the Indian Territory. The Cherokee people, however, had adopted European ways perhaps even more effectively than any other tribe. They also had good lawyers among them, trained in American law and legal procedure. They took their case through the court system all the way to the American Supreme Court. They argued that their existing treaties with the American government had made them a sovereign nation and that they should be allowed to remain on their ancestral land. The Supreme Court agreed and ruled that the Indian Removal Act did not apply to them. President Andrew Jackson, however, defied the Supreme Court and allowed the state of Georgia to force the removal of the Cherokee people to what was then called the Indian Territory. In 1907, this Indian Territory became known as the state of Oklahoma. The removal of the Cherokee was a tragedy of enormous proportions. Many had to walk the entire route from the Appalachian Mountains to Oklahoma. At least 5,000 Cherokee people died along the way to their new home in Oklahoma. Others suffered enormous hardships along the way, and still more hardships when they arrived and tried to settle in their new home. Their tragic march came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Meherabad's automobile trip, both to and from Prague, Oklahoma, followed closely along one of the main routes of this Trail of Tears. Baba's accident occurred at a spot almost precisely in the middle of what had once been designated as Indian Territory. Over the course of the 19th century, in addition to the so-called 5 civilized tribes, many more Native American tribes were moved into this Indian territory. Other tribes were allotted space on arid, often unlivable reservations scattered throughout the country. One historian has shown that Adolf Hitler based his concentration camp system in Nazi Germany on the reservation system that the American government had created in their effort to control the native population. Throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries, native treaties with the American government were repeatedly broken by the government. And even today, many of these agreements continue to be broken. In one particularly cruel offense, literally millions of buffalo, an animal sacred to the Lakota people, were slaughtered with the main intention of denying these Plains Indians their natural source of food, winter clothing, and tools. The Black Hills of Dakota, an area of land sacred to the Lakota people, had been promised to them in perpetuity. However, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills, this promise too was rescinded. In a similar way, when oil was discovered in Oklahoma, land that had been promised to the native people who had relocated there was also taken away from them and given to others. Meherabad suffered greatly during and after his terrible accident in the middle of the Indian Territory near Prague, Oklahoma. After a 12-day stay at the Prague Clinic, where he was cared for by Dr. Ned Burleson and his staff, Baba traveled some 1,500 miles by ambulance along the same Trail of Tears route on his way back to Myrtle Beach, where he stayed at Elizabeth Patterson's home there, Yukon Dunes. Except for a trip to Duke University Hospital and the one previously mentioned trip to the Meher Spiritual Center, Baba remained at Yukon Dunes convalescing for just over 4 weeks. Well, we've reflected now on some possible ways that Meher Baba's accident in Prague might have been connected with his uprooting of some of America's binding karma around its cruel and dishonest treatment of Native American people. Was his accident in Prague the end of it? Or did his work continue while he was convalescing in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina? Was there any binding karma in South Carolina that Baba might have been working on uprooting? We've already mentioned that African slaves made up much of the labor force of the first American colony, founded by a Spanish explorer on the Pee River in Georgetown, South Carolina. This colony was not far from where Baba was staying at Yukon Dunes. Just 40 miles south of Georgetown is the city of Charleston, South Carolina, which by the late 16th century had become a major center for the slave trade. Between 1505 and 1888, around 12 million Africans were enslaved and brought to the Americas. An estimated 15%, or almost 2 million, of those Africans transported across the Atlantic by ship died during their voyage across the ocean. Their bodies were thrown overboard as an acceptable cost of doing business. By 1860, there were approximately 4 million slaves in the United States. 10% of these slaves, around 400,000, lived in South Carolina. Many of these slaves worked on South Carolina rice plantations. Due to the lucrative rice business in South Carolina, Charleston became the capital of the American slave trade. It was here that many enslaved African people first landed when they arrived in America. From Charleston, enslaved Africans were then exported to other inland slave states. In downtown Charleston, the slave market still stands as a reminder of the inhuman brutality that existed there as a part of the robust American economy for over 300 years. Even after the end of slavery, race laws were enacted in America, especially in the South, designed to oppress and control people of African descent. Again, historians have shown that Adolf Hitler designed many of his laws limiting the freedom of Jews in Nazi Germany by studying American race laws. Now, as I've said, all of these references to Native Americans and African Americans are my own speculations. To my knowledge, Meher Baba never said anything openly about these issues. However, two interesting incidents are often referenced in regard to these communities. The first occurred during Meher Baba's first visit to the Meher Spiritual Center in 1952. According to Lord Meher, on Saturday, the 17th of May, 1952, a large open house gathering was held at the Meher Spiritual Center. At that time, quote, almost 1,000 people had been invited, including a number from the local black community. Those present noticed that whenever a black visitor entered the barn, Baba always rose from his seat and went to greet them. Close quote. He did not rise from his seat when white visitors arrived. Another incident of note occurred in December of 1934 while Baba and his party traveled by train to the west coast of America. According to this excerpt from Lord Meher, quote, the train halted in Albuquerque, New Mexico for 30 minutes at noon on the 17th. Baba spelled Indian on the palm of his hand. He suddenly left his compartment with Ruano. The Mondali followed them. Baba walked 2 blocks away from the station, arm in arm with Ruano. Then he spotted a small side street. Abruptly, he turned down it and continued on as if he knew exactly where he was headed. Ruano's only thought was that they were going to miss that train. Baba stopped when he noticed 2 Native American Indians, probably Navajo, standing on the corner. One was selling trinkets, and he walked away as soon as Baba approached. The other Indian was a tall, fat man with a red bandana tied around his head. He stayed exactly where he was. He and Baba then stood facing one another. Their eyes met, but no words were spoken. Baba then walked quickly back to the station and boarded the train. Once on the train, Ruano narrated the incident to the others, and Baba commented about the Indian. Quote, he is one of my agents. He is the direct agent in charge of America. Close quote. Baba later explained that he was an agent of the 4th plane, one of 4 in the world, with subtle powers. End of quote. Well, in 1932, during a reception at the Knickerbocker Hotel in Hollywood, Baba gave a message which said, in part, quote, the root of all our difficulties, individual and social, is self-interest. Eliminate self-interest and you will solve all your problems, individual and social. But the elimination of self-interest, even granting a sincere desire on the part of the individual to accomplish it, is not so easy and is never completely achieved except by the aid of a perfect master. For self-interest springs from a false idea of the true nature of the self, and this idea must be eradicated and the truth experienced before that elimination of self-interest is possible. Close quote. It is my belief that there are no coincidences where Meher Baba is concerned. I submit that even to this day, the greatest spiritual bindings holding back the people of America are its history of violence and mistreatment against the native people of America and the enslavement and violent mistreatment of African people who were originally brought to America in chains. I do not believe that it was a coincidence that Meher Baba's 1952 automobile accident happened in the middle of what had once been called the Indian Territory, or that his travel back and forth to this spot occurred along the main route of what has been called the Trail of Tears. Neither do I believe that it was a coincidence that his convalescence from this terrible accident took place in an area that had once been the earliest and most robust center of the slave trade in the Americas. I further suggest that the enormous suffering that Meher Baba, his beloved Mera, and the other Mondali underwent during his complicated free life period was connected to both his new life and his Mononash work, and that even today, amidst apparent chaos and upheaval, Meher Baba's suffering in America in 1952 continues to be of great spiritual benefit to America. I close now with what I feel to be a pertinent quote from Meher Baba's discourses. Quote, "The spinning of the yarn of karmic debts and dues would be endless if there had been no provision for getting out of the karmic entanglements through the help of the Master. He can not only initiate the aspirant into the supreme art of unbinding karma, but he can become directly instrumental in freeing him from his karmic entanglements. The Master has attained unity with God, whose cosmic and universal life includes all persons. Being one with all life, he can become, in his representative capacity for the sake of the aspirant, the medium for the clearing up of all debts and dues which have come into existence through the aspirant's dealings with countless persons contacted in his incarnations. If a person must get bound to someone, it is best for him to get bound to God or the Master, because this tie ultimately facilitates emancipation from all other karmic ties." End of quote. Avatar, Meher Baba ki jai, just a phrase we occasionally say until it seeps into our hearts and our souls day by day. And in time, it will flow like the blood in our veins, through the trees with the wind and the rain, until only your praises remain. And so we say, Avatar Meher Baba ki jai, for every soul who into this world faith may bring. You have fought like a warrior king, and for our sakes have renounced everything. With your blood pouring into the ground where you lay, without uttering a sound on that day, you paid the debt for us we could not pay. And so we say, Avatar Meher Baba ki jai. Avatar Meher Baba ki jai. May your work be successful, we pray. With our glasses raised high in communion, we say, Avatar Meher Baba ki jai. For those driven from their Native American homes, forced to forsake their histories and roam far away from their ancestors' bones. Though they prayed to their Maker for thousands of years, they were condemned to shed thousands of tears while living out all the worst of their fears. For them we say, Avatar Meherabad ki jai. And for those who arrive on the waterfront docks of old Charleston in chains firmly locked, to be sold on the auctioneer's block, stripped of all their belongings of family and kin, like beasts of burden, both women and men, searching the world for the hand of a friend. For them we say, Avatar Meherabad ki jai. Avatar Meherabad ki jai. May your work be successful, we pray. With our glasses raised high in communion, we say, Avatar Meherabad ki jai. And so now, for every child who has suffered and cried, for those pursued who have no place to hide, for every soul who has lingered and died, for everyone upon this troubled and beleaguered earth, beset with heartaches and sorrows and worse, across the expanse of this whole universe. For them we say, Avatar Meherabad ki jai. Avatar Meherabad ki jai. May your work be successful, we pray. With our glasses raised high in communion, we say, Avatar Meherabad ki jai. Avatar Meherabad ki jai.